Okay, good, 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 good.
Hi, Matthew. So we got 9 students and 2 of us.
Give it to a couple more minutes and then
That's fine. It's all good.
then we'll start and then I'm going to introduce you and we hit the ground running.
We're only 2 minutes into this class, Jakob, so we're doing good. If we have 10 students, 2 minutes, into it. And this is a new video system that many may not have installed before.
There is always the first time.
Are you, Jakob, using the online version, the web browser version?
Yeah, I think so. Yes. I may start use it instead of what I'm using now, but we'll see. I'm going to discuss it with him. We'll see how their experience will be, and then if they like it, I will probably switch to this one.
Mm-hmm. If you guys can hear a siren in the background, it's not that we have a breakdown of law and order here yet. It's that I live near a hospital, so those sirens happen quite a lot.
Recording it, Alex, right?
Hmm?
Recording, right?
Students are still undisciplined, they allow themselves to be late.
Yeah, by a few minutes. It's a new system though. So.
All right, guys, let's start. So it gives me a great pleasure to thank Alex for agreeing to come and talk to us. So Alex is a computer programmer, and you may actually use some of the stuff that he invented. For example, he invented autocomplete. When you start typing something and then it completes the word. This is a feature that was first introduced by Alex. And later, Alex became very interested in Bitcoin, and what he's going to do now, he's going to share some issues and details that that are very unique. I mean, and because he has a very unique perspective on that. So I hope that you will enjoy the class. So basically, the plan is 15 minutes video, right? Like 10, 15 minutes video. Then Alex is going to discuss some feature of Bitcoins that I think that he finds the most amazing, the most fascinating, and then it's going to be all free for all. You guys will be free to ask questions, discuss things, whatever you guys want to do. Okay, so I'll give the permission to Alex to speak. Thank you, Alex.
All right. Well, thanks for coming, everyone. So my plan is to show a 12-minute video. Then I'll talk for about 5 minutes about a couple of major conceptual features of Bitcoin. And then we'll go into an open discussion where we can discuss anything you like, okay? So let me share the video. And the video is basically, this guy wrote a book about Bitcoin, and I've read so many books and so many articles and seen all kinds of videos. But over the years, if there was one source of information about Bitcoin, I would say this is it. This is the last book you ever need to buy, and he does like a brief summary with slides of it in 12 minutes. Okay. So here we go. 1 second. I think I killed the browser videos. Sorry, let me bring it back up. Accidentally killed the tab. It's not yahoo.com, it's youtube.com. History. So let me stop sharing for a second while I bring up the video. I'll be there in a second. Okay, here it is. Here it is, I found it. Okay.
For me, I think is the most important aspect of it. And from it come all of the interesting economic ideas.
All right, here we go.
My talk today is going to summarize some of the main ideas in my book, The Bitcoin Standard. And I'm going to try and keep the talk as quick as possible so that we can have more and more time for discussion. Because generally the discussion tends to be a richer part of the talk. So in brief, what I'm going to be discussing today is why I think Bitcoin is unique, what Bitcoin is good for, and what are the implications of continuing to have a form of hard money that is similar to Bitcoin on various levels. So in a very brief summary of the first few chapters of my book, why is it that Bitcoin matters? In my opinion, it matters because it is hard money, or what I mean by that is, to understand the dynamic, we think of it this way. Anything can basically be used as money. Anybody can hold anything and use it as a medium of exchange. But then that same thing can be produced in increasing quantities, which will bring down the price and therefore make it not very good as a store of value. So therefore, anything that is easy to make ends up being not very useful as a form of money. And only things that are hard to make end up succeeding in the long run as form of money. And the first few chapters of my book get into this in detail. Those of you who are interested can read it there. So if we look at examples, historical examples of money, we find that anything that's chosen as money at any point in time ends up being chosen because it is hard to make at that instant. And so we look at Bitcoin. If this is true, then it matters for Bitcoin, because if you look at Bitcoin's supply, we see that the supply increases at a decreasing rate and then stabilizes at 21 million. And the supply growth rate continuously decreases until it approaches zero asymptotically. And then eventually the supply growth goes to zero. So the uniqueness of Bitcoin as a form of money really is the fact that with every other form of money, the fact that it gets chosen as money will increase the desire for people to produce more and more of it, which is going to increase the supply of it and bring the price of it down, except with Bitcoin. No matter how many people use Bitcoin, the supply of Bitcoin is fixed. The supply growth rate is going to be fixed. And this is very different than anything else we've seen. In other words, if tomorrow 5 people around the world are using Bitcoin only, the new supply of Bitcoins that will be minted tomorrow is going to be about 1,800 coins. On the other hand, if 5 million people or 5 billion people are using Bitcoin tomorrow, still the new supply of Bitcoins that is going to be made is 1,800. The fact that the supply is completely irresponsive and unrelated to the demand is something absolutely unique to Bitcoin amongst all monetary assets. And that, for me, I think is the most important aspect of it. And from it come all of the interesting economic ideas behind Bitcoin. The reason really, if we want to understand why Bitcoin has gone up for so long, and people say Bitcoin is a bubble, but Bitcoin has gone up about 300-400 or 30-40 million% in about 10 years. In less than 10 years of trading, since it started trading, since it's accrued any economic value, it's gone up by that much. There's never been a bubble like this. Nothing that's a bubble increases by these insane amounts, if it was to do so. So how can we understand it? For me, we cannot understand it outside of understanding Bitcoin's hardness. In other words, this cycle that I described in my book, which is what differentiates Bitcoin from every other kind of money. If you look at any other kind of money, if store of value demand increases, the price rises, mining that money or printing more of it, for the case of government money, makes it becomes more attractive. That increases the supply, which causes the price to drop. In Bitcoin, instead of the supply increasing, we don't get more supply increasing because the supply is fixed. Because of the dynamics of how mining works, which unfortunately I don't really have the time to get into right now, but you can read about them in my book. Because of the way mining works with Bitcoin, if more money goes into Bitcoin and more demand goes for Bitcoin and the price rises and mining is more attractive, we don't get an increase in the supply of Bitcoin, we get an increase in the hash power that goes into Bitcoin, which effectively makes the network more expensive to attack, which effectively means Bitcoin survives longer and continues to operate successfully and safely, which increases the store of value demand for it, which raises its price. This is really, I think, the economic incentive feedback loop that Satoshi Nakamoto put into his code, and that has been functioning for the past 10 years, and really seems to be stronger than any of us, really. We have no choice but to submit to it, because it just feeds in very well to humans' economic incentives. Bitcoin is such a well-oiled economic incentive machine that is constantly giving the world incentives to keep feeding it with the things that continue to make it run and continue to make it secure. How secure is Bitcoin? The processing power to run Bitcoin is about 7 trillion times of that in your laptop, which is an enormous amount of processing power given that it makes only 500,000 transactions. You could run the same number of transactions on your own laptop, but the difference, of course, with Bitcoin is that we do it without having to trust you or without having to trust your laptop. It's a completely automated system that relies on nobody. The key thing about why Bitcoin functions, and again, I'm skipping over the technical details here, which you can read in the book, but I'm trying to get to the economic implications, is there's no single point of failure in Bitcoin. There's no single piece of critical hardware or infrastructure for Bitcoin to continue operating. There's no single critical individual or organization that Bitcoin needs. And Bitcoin effectively can't be stopped. Anyone who wants to join the network just needs a device that can that can receive around 1 or 2 megabytes of data every 10 minutes. And that doesn't even need to be an internet connected device now. And with this economic incentive system, we've never had one bad transaction, one fraudulent transaction get confirmed in 10 years, which is an astonishing security record. So we have the hardest money that's ever invented. It's available worldwide for anyone who can receive basically 2 megabytes of data every 10 minutes. It's purely voluntary. It does not need regulation, enforcement, or police. And most interestingly, perhaps, it's chosen freely on the market. It gained its value on the market. Nobody forces anybody to use it as a monetary system. And yet people freely choose to pay with it, which is the definition that Austrian school economists like to give for sound money. It's money whose value is one on the market and determined between the people who carry out the exchange. It's not money that is enforced by government. And that's really, I think, a very interesting thing about it. So with this description of the basic economic infrastructure of Bitcoin, what is Bitcoin good for? The first thing, I think the obvious thing, is that it is good as a store of value, because it is, as I mentioned earlier, the first strictly scarce liquid asset that we have. In other words, the supply can never be increased, which is unique for all other kinds of resources that we have, physical resources. The limit on how much we can have of each one of them is never actually how much of them exists in the crust of the earth, which is why for millions of years we've been digging in the earth and we've never run out of any actual metal that exists in earth. The reason for that is that metals, the abundance with which we produce them is not about how much of them exist, it's about how much time we dedicate to producing them compared to other things. That's really what determines how much gold or copper or zinc or anything we have. And so more demand for copper or zinc or gold or anything is going to lead to an increase in the production of it, although that's not true only for one thing, and that is Bitcoin. It's the first thing that is scarce. And one of my favorite books in economics is by an economist called Julian Simon, and it's called The Ultimate Resource. In it, he argues that really the only resource that we have is human time, because with human time, we can make more of everything else. That's why we've never run out of anything. And with human time, we continue to find new technologies and new ways of making things that are more productive, and that continues to increase the productivity and continues to increase the value of our time, which is the only thing that is really scarce, whose value continues to go up over time. And so with Bitcoin now, we finally have something else that's also strictly scarce, something like our time, but whose supply can't be increased. And so for me, that sounds like it is a natural match for storing the value of the time that we produce, storing the value that we produce with our time, really. And so I think this is why I like to call Bitcoin our most advanced technology for transferring the value of time into the future. Because with every other technology, which is what money is a technology for transferring value across time. Money, the most advanced way of doing it is the way that suffers the least loss. The most efficient way of converting value today into value tomorrow is always going to be the money whose supply is the least inflationary, whose supply increases the least in the long run. And so Bitcoin does this with exceptional success so far, at least, through the economic incentive structure that I'd mentioned earlier. And I think this is what makes it such a compelling and interesting economic phenomena, because as soon as people start using it as a store of value, of course, the necessary function that comes along with that is that it is a medium of exchange. Those two functions are inseparable. And so it's necessary, if people want to hold it as a store of value, of course, they're going to want to exchange it. And so what we're seeing now is the development of a global, decentralized system for the transfer of value that is the only viable alternative to global central banks. It's the only competition that central banks face in the world today. It's Bitcoin. If you want to send money today from Hong Kong to the US or to Canada or to Argentina, you have to go through the central bank and through the global central banking authorities of the world. And that's just one monopoly entity. And there are no alternatives to that. There are no legal alternatives for you to do it. There are no ways for you to be able to send money abroad outside of the control of the central bank, except with Bitcoin now. Bitcoin allows us a viable alternative to it. So then that brings up the question of, does Bitcoin scale? Can Bitcoin scale? In my opinion, and as I discuss in detail in my book, Bitcoin is not going to scale as a payment network. Bitcoin is going to scale as a settlement network on which second layers will be used for consumer payments. So Bitcoin's inability to support billions of transactions per day is no impediment for it. Bitcoin's on-chain capacity and its inability to support millions of transactions per day is, I think, no comparison for it, because Bitcoin doesn't compete with individual market consumer payments like Western Union or PayPal or Visa payments. It competes most likely with the settlement payments between central banks, which are high value payments that take a long time to confirm. Bitcoin is able to produce these payments and to send the money across the world in about an hour with getting 6 confirmations, which is a very high degree of certainty with it. It's an enormously compelling competitive for many people for central banks, and that's why it's been growing so massively over time. What, for me, is the most interesting implication of hard money is...
All right. So that was a brief video. And I guess let's open up the floor to questions, because there was a lot of interesting points made in the video. Just as a provocative thing, one of the points he made was that Bitcoin is not optional. Nobody has an option to ignore it. In fact, the author put it in one of his tweets later, something like, Bitcoin will not be adopted as the iPhone was because it's cool. It will be adopted the same way as gunpowder was adopted. In other words, those who do not adopt it will become its victims. What he means by that is that value stored in other softer forms of money will eventually escape into a harder form of storage, which Bitcoin is. So in other words, ignoring Bitcoin is not an option. Okay, any questions?
Guys, this is something that you want to think about, because, you know, you've been in finance for 4 years. You know, you are going to graduate.
Okay, so I think we have a question.
Yeah.
Can you explain why it is limited to 21 million coins? Okay, so that's a good question. Ultimately, what Bitcoin is a networking protocol. A networking protocol is basically a collection of rules for exchanging messages over a communication network. And the rules specify which messages are valid and which are invalid. One of the types of messages present in the Bitcoin protocol is so-called blocks. Blocks are just batches or groups of transactions that are time-stamped in a decentralized way by the network. And whoever performs sufficient work or sufficient, in other words, there's sort of like a lottery going on around the world, where on average every 10 minutes, one of the computers by random chance guesses the right nonsensical number, so-called nonce, that solves the proof of work puzzle. And once the puzzle is solved, the network will allow the solution to the puzzle to be broadcast in the header of a block. And whoever discovered the solution has the option to send himself freshly minted coins in the first transaction of the block. But there's a strict rule about how many of these coins are issued. So the rule is that in the first 4-year era, in other words, it's not actually measured in time, it's measured in the number of blocks. First 210,000 blocks, the block reward, which is the reward for solving a proof of work puzzle, was 50 coins. As soon as the last block in the first era is discovered, all subsequent blocks have to basically can no longer issue 50 coins. They must now issue half of the previous amount, which is 25. And now we're in the third era, where only 12.5 Bitcoins are issued for every 10-minute block. And 29 days from now, we'll enter the fourth era, when the block reward will be cut in half. Now, if you calculate all the block rewards from the initial Genesis block into the future, then all of them add up to 21 million possible Bitcoins issued as rewards for solving the proof of work puzzles. With the reward being cut by 50% every 4 years, there's like a curve that basically can never exceed 21 million cumulative coins issued. And the last coin will be issued 130 years from now. But basically at this point, 88% of all the Bitcoins have already been discovered, and we have 130 years to discover the remaining 12%. Okay, so another question. We can store value both in Bitcoin and in gold. What is the advantage of Bitcoin over gold? So according to Saifedean, Bitcoin just represents harder money. So it's much more difficult to produce than gold. In fact, its production schedule is specified ahead of time, and it has a strict upper limit, 21 million. Now, when it comes to gold production, we have 1.8 to 2% annual production relative to the existing stockpile that's been built up over 3,000-4,000 years. But if some mining technique were to be discovered, or Elon Musk sends very inexpensive large cargoes into orbit, and we can start capturing gold-laden asteroids, right? The supply of gold will explode. So the gold is just historically scarce. It's kind of outcompeted all the other metals, and it's become kind of a store of value for that reason. But we have something better now. We have something that has strict mathematical certainty, 21 million coins. And the inflation rate of Bitcoin is about to drop from 3.9% to 1.85% in 29 days. And gold is roughly the same, a little bit smaller. And in 2024, Bitcoin will have half the inflation rate of gold. So going forward, I mean, besides the fact that gold is physical and therefore subject to all the physical restrictions, you cannot take gold across airport security, for example, right? And Bitcoin goes anywhere, and you can carry it in your brain. So gold just has a lot of disadvantages as a physical medium, store of value, and that's why it was demonetized by the central banks. When basically, the gold could only function as a standard form of money if it was held in large institutions. And once all the gold was hoarded in large banks, gold banks, it was easy for governments to essentially capture all that gold and to then switch from the gold standard to the paper standard that we're on right now. So gold is a good store of value. It's scarce, but it has other disadvantages. Like, for example, you need to drill every bar of gold you get. How do you know it's gold? Bitcoin cannot be counterfeited cryptographically. So, anybody else? This is a good question. How did Bitcoin initially get some sort of value? So there's a theory that a monetary medium undergoes a sequence of transformations before it becomes used as money. And in fact, it has to go through a stage called collectibles. If you look historically, gold underwent all these transformations. If you look at cavemen, right, they would find small nuggets of gold in rivers and they would keep them as collectibles, or they would use them as pieces of jewelry for important people. Once something becomes a collectible, then it undergoes a standardization process where, you know, gold underwent that once they started melting gold and measuring its weight. Then then they started stamping coins with gold. Then eventually gold became a medium of exchange in the 1800s, and even a unit of account in, you know, fractions of gold. So initially Bitcoin was a collectible. You know, people would mine Bitcoin, but there was no way to use it for anything, and they would just sort of play with it as a toy. It was a classic collectible. Then there were crazy developments, like somebody paid 10,000 Bitcoins for a pizza, or somebody else. In fact, a big Bitcoin exchange in the early years was called Mt. Gox, and it was created by a person who wanted to buy Bitcoins but couldn't buy them anywhere. So he said, I will launch an exchange and allow people to exchange Bitcoins for fiat currency. And once the exchange is running, then I will be able to buy Bitcoin. So it was basically a self-fulfilling prophecy type of bootstrap. So at first, a few collectors, then somebody wanted to buy it. Then the price was established and the price started fluctuating. Then more and more people understood the implications of a strictly scarce asset. And right now we're in the stage of Bitcoin crossing from a commodity to a store of value. It's not really a store of value yet, or maybe it's a reserve asset or something like that. But it's sort of a precious commodity right now. Okay, so another question from Spencer. How is the value determined? A simple answer is that all values are subjective, right? If you have a nugget of gold and you're in a boat in the middle of the ocean, it does you no good. You know, you need water to drink and food to eat. So that gold is worthless to you at that point. On the other hand, food would be worthless to someone who has plenty of food. So value is subjective, but price is something that people arrive at when they trade during free exchange. So next question from Chi Zhang. Is it good for economy if Bitcoin becomes prevalent, since there is no industry needed to support this kind of money? Why should there be an industry to support money? I mean, it's a digital gold. It's superior to gold in many respects. It's impossible to counterfeit. It's impossible to censor. You can have it without people knowing that you have it, you know, et cetera, et cetera. I would think of it as a reserve asset, sort of for the foreseeable future. It's not gonna replace government currency, because government currency is mandated for use by legal tender laws, right? You still have to pay your taxes in your local government issued currency, and contracts are still written, and debts to banks and so on and so forth in local government currency. So that creates demand for local government currency, which will continue. But similar to how governments today stockpile gold and foreign currency, you know, sooner or later, one of them will start stockpiling Bitcoin. In fact, we don't even know. I mean, it could be the Swiss central bank or some small Caribbean central bank already has Bitcoin. We wouldn't know about it. So I don't see an issue with supporting this kind of money. So what happens when we hit 21 million coins? Will there be a need for a newer version of Bitcoin or something similar? The simple answer is no, because Bitcoin is ultimately infinitely divisible. So currently 1 million coin, I mean, each coin can be divided into 100 million pieces called Satoshis, but there could be an upgrade to the system in the future where we can add another, you know, 9 or 12 zeros of divisibility to each coin without changing anything about the protocol. So if each coin is divisible into infinitely small pieces, then the number of pieces that are available for trade, you know, it's 21 quadrillion today, right? It's 21 million times 100 million. We will never have any shortage of fine-grained units. In fact, if you were to use Satoshis today, then your prices would look similar to Korean won, right? You know, simple things like $1 items would cost around 2,000 to 3,000 Satoshis. So you could theoretically denominate all the trade in them today. And in the future, in fact, like in the Lightning Network, each Satoshi is divisible into 1 million pieces. So you could pay in fractional Satoshis. Okay, another question from Spencer. How would price become less volatile? So the answer to that is that as the total market capitalization of Bitcoin grows, it takes more and more money to change the price in a significant way. And it gains more and more inertia, right? So today Bitcoin is a $120, $130 billion asset. At its peak, it was $380 billion asset. You know, within a year or two, it might become a $500 billion asset. But basically, the larger it is, the more inertia it has. And if you look historically, the volatility has been gradually declining. But it will still stay volatile, you know, for foreseeable future. It's also the only asset that can trade 24/7. So, for example, on March 12th, you had panic in the stock market because of the coronavirus, and Bitcoin collapsed 50% in one day. It has since recovered almost everything, but it was the only thing you could sell at any time of day or night, 7 days a week around the world, because everything else is not traded, you know, continuously, but Bitcoin is. So it basically, it's the most sensitive indicator of the sentiment of, you know, fear versus greed. Okay. MT is asking, who is in charge of updating and maintaining the system? The miners? So the simple answer is nobody is in charge. And let me give you an analogy so that you can understand it. If somebody was in charge of Bitcoin, Bitcoin would not be interesting at all. It would be just another system controlled by an organization, okay? So my simple comparison to that is the internet, right? Who is in charge of maintaining and operating the internet? Well, the answer is nobody's in charge. Why? Well, because the internet is a protocol that specifies a collection of rules for exchanging of messages. Now, if anybody injects a message into the internet that doesn't comply with any of the rules, internet computers, you know, billions of internet nodes out there that are connected to the internet, starting from your phones to the, basically, you know, I have like 50 devices in my house connected to the internet, including like smoke detectors and, you know, the thermostat and the TV and et cetera, et cetera. All those devices have internet protocol embedded in them. If they detect a message that's not strictly compliant with the protocol, they will simply drop the message. So the end result of this is that if anybody out there were to come out and say, well, we propose a new version of the internet protocol where we take existing messages, but we alter them in some way. Let's say we add a field where, you know, every protocol message is signed by the person sending it. So that way, you know, let's say the Chinese Communist Party wants to monitor its citizens, right? So the rest of the internet not only will ignore them, they will not even know that they exist, right? Because you can disconnect yourself from the internet, but the internet at large doesn't care. It will just ignore non-compliant messages. Well, Bitcoin works the same way. It's a collection of rules adopted by distributed nodes, 100,000 nodes around the network. But Bitcoin is even more conservative because Bitcoin is expecting to be under attack at all times. So whenever it sees a non-compliant message, it assumes that the other node who sent it is an attacker and immediately disconnects it, right? So Bitcoin doesn't care about any attempts to alter the rules. It possesses what I call protocol rigidity. In other words, internet and Bitcoin and email systems like that, they're not under anybody's control. They're sort of frozen in time, right? Half frozen in time. So what do I mean by that? So Bitcoin has a collection of rules on the messages. That's the existing version of the protocol. This collection of rules will be enforced by all the nodes in perpetuity forever. And you cannot alter any of the existing rules, right? However, you can add an additional rule that constrains messages even more because all the existing nodes will not be aware of this additional rule. So the messages that will be reaching them will be a subset of the previously, you know, valid messages, and they will accept them, but they will not know of the newly added rules. So bottom line is that the rules of the system, such as 21 million coins at the most, the size of blocks, you know, hundreds of other parameters, cannot be altered at all by anyone. There's absolutely no control. It's similar to the way as there's just to upgrade inertia. Even if there was a genuine need to upgrade the network, it would be impossible to do because you cannot phone call 100,000 people who speak different languages and don't care what you have to say, you cannot tell them to upgrade their software, basically. This is the same way as the internet, right? The question about isn't the Forex market open 24/7? The answer is yes, it's open 24/7 between banks, but you as an individual cannot access it, right? However, as an individual, you can always take your Bitcoin that you're storing in your hand and send it to one of the Bitcoin trading platforms 24/7 and liquidate it in case you think that, you know, civilization is going downhill and you need to raise some cash or whatever. So the miners, by the way, to finish the question about who's in charge, the miners have a very, very minor role in the system. Namely, they are allowed to broadcast blocks with solutions to proof of work puzzles, but these blocks must be valid according to hundreds of rules. So basically what they do is they timestamp groups of transactions and append them to the chain. And the miners basically select which transactions will go into the next block based on whoever's paying them more, because there's a limited amount of block space in the block, and the block space is a valuable commodity. So the miners basically want to pick of all the transactions that are floating around, they want to pick the ones that are paying them the highest amount of fee per byte. And then they stuff the block with the highest paying transactions first. And once they solve the proof of work puzzle, they broadcast it to the network. But the network must agree that the block is valid. So for example, there's been cases where a miner would attempt to create more money than the rules allow. And what happens is that all the 100,000 nodes just simply refuse this block. And the miner has burned, you know, $100,000 worth of electricity mining the block. And it has nothing to show for it, right? Because the block was rejected from the authoritative history of the chain by the other nodes. So miners basically just get to select transactions that go into the next block. Okay, so we've got another question from Spencer. What strategies are used to forecast the price of BTC, and what do you think is an investing strategy with BTC? So I'm not going to give any investment advice, but let me comment this. BTC is notoriously unpredictable, right? What is known about it is that its supply is decreasing. The supply of new BTC is continuously decreasing. In the book, The Bitcoin Standard, the author introduces this very valuable metric called stock to flow ratio, which basically measures a scarcity of an asset. So stock to flow compares the existing stockpile, which he calls stock, to flow, which is the annual production of new monetary medium. So in case of gold, it's like 60 right now. In case of silver, it's 22. In case of Bitcoin, it's 25. And 29 days from now, it will jump to 50. So it will still be below gold for a few years, and then it will jump again to 100, and it will exceed gold. So there's also a group of people out there that claim the price of Bitcoin is closely tracking stock to flow ratio with bubbles and collapses around it. So there's like a trend line, exponential trend line, where the price is tracking the stock to flow ratio, which gets updated suddenly every 4 years and then gradually in between. You can basically Google various articles on the subject. I kind of like the idea of stock to flow. I think it's just too optimistic in the long run, because the price of Bitcoin has to level off a little bit. It cannot continue to grow at this rate. I mean, it's already up over 100,000 times, right? If it's up another 100 times, it will become, you know, bigger than gold, which it probably will, you know, given a few years. It's just a slow process of discovery and adoption. Yes. B&H strategy. What's B&H? Okay. Buy and hold. Yeah. Okay. So the most in the Bitcoin world, the kind of the popular strategy is called HODLing, or HODL. It's like a misspelling of the word hold. It's simply that you buy Bitcoin and hold it, because, you know, you're trying to time the market. You're risking missing the train, so to speak. I mean, if you look at the chart, it's you know, $100 invested in Bitcoin 5 years ago would have been, you know, $10,000 today. So, but in the meantime, you know, you had spikes and collapses. So I guess I would not allocate more than 5% of my portfolio to Bitcoin, because it's a very volatile asset. But under 5%, you could, maybe a good strategy is to dollar cost average into it. You do weekly or monthly purchases of $100, $500, or $1,000 worth of Bitcoin. That should lower the average buying price. Okay. All right, so how are we doing time-wise? We're at 1:12. I guess one more thing I wanted to talk about, if there's no more questions, and I'll take more questions if they come up, is that Bitcoin is unique in that it is a completely trustless system. So what do I mean by that? You can land from another planet here, or you can come out of a cave where you've been sitting for 10 or 20 years, and without trusting anyone at all, you can just get a book that specifies protocol messages, their format, and actions that need to be taken. You can write your own software, or you can download and audit one of the implementations of the protocol. And without trusting any institution, you will simply request historical blocks from beginning of time until now. And once you build out a valid heaviest chain, and what I mean by heaviest is the chain that has had the largest amount of work performed on it, because see, at any given point, you can have miners discover two alternative blocks, both of which point back to the previous block. And so there needs to be a rule that picks one branch of the chain versus the other. So the rule is that basically the chain with the highest cumulative difficulty is by definition the truth. So what does that entail? Like why is that interesting? It's interesting because if you've been sitting in the cave, or you're sitting inside China, inside the Great Firewall of China, faking giving you a fake version of history becomes a very expensive proposition. Why? Well, because the chain is self-certifying. Every block has a proof of destruction of energy in it, right? And if you add up all the destroyed energy all the way to the beginning, you see gigawatts and gigawatts of electricity destroyed, and that's what defines the correct chain. So therefore, somebody who is feeding you the fake information will have to expend a huge amount of energy to compete with the real chain. So as long as you have one source of information that's truthful, that's giving you the correct information, you can have, there is no democracy here. You can have 10,000 votes, 10,000 nodes feeding you the wrong chain. As long as you're connected to one feeding you the correct chain, you will abandon all the fake chains, right? And the consequence of this is that even if we go into something like a zombie apocalypse where the internet and electricity go away, when they come back 100 or 200 years later, if somebody finds a few USB stick drives, right? Or even one USB stick drive that has Bitcoin blockchain on it, nobody else needs to trust this guy that he's giving them the right version of Bitcoin to reconstitute after the apocalypse. Why? Because the data on the stick will be self-certifying. It will come with proofs of destruction of energy. And whoever finds a stick that has a chain with more energy destroyed, that will be the one that reconstitutes Bitcoin in the future. Its survivability is just mind-boggling. Like right now, for example, you don't even need to be connected to the internet to get the right chain, because it's now broadcast from satellites around the world. And even if you're sitting behind, some kind of firewall that's blocking Bitcoin, your local little antenna will start receiving blocks from the satellite, and the blocks will come with proof of energy destroyed, and you will know that you're on the right chain. Okay, so we had another question come in. What's your opinion with people who trade Bitcoin daily? Well, it could be a bad habit, similar to gambling, I guess. I don't really do it, and I don't endorse it. It's sort of a form of adrenaline addiction, I guess. Okay, another question. Are there tradable futures for VIX on Bitcoin like there's on stock market? There is a few small providers that provide futures. I think Chicago Mercantile Exchange, CME, provides both options and futures for Bitcoin. And you can look at CME Bitcoin options or futures. All right. Maybe you can discuss other currencies as well. Okay, so there's a lot of so-called altcoins. And the question is always brought up, why won't Bitcoin fall victim to hundreds or thousands of these altcoins? And the answer to that is this concept called shelling point. So let me illustrate the concept with this. Suppose you're a student who lives in New York City, and you get a text message saying that and you broadcast a text message to 1,000 students saying that please assemble in the most obvious place in New York City. And if 80 or 90% of you come to this place without communicating with each other, then you all get a $100 reward. Now, if you think about it, in New York City, you need to find the most well-known, centrally located place, right? So people might think, well, it's the main Union Station, right? And what's within the main Union train station? Well, there is like an information desk in the middle with a big clock. So actually, students might default to that, or at least enough of them might default to that location to assemble, because they will all think of it as a Schelling point. In other words, a Schelling point is something that people know implicitly without having to communicate with other things, with other people. Well, Bitcoin is now a Schelling point for safe store of value usage, right? Now, even though there's hundreds of other altcoins, none of them is actually interesting because none of them is decentralized. So what does it mean? It means that they all have a dev team or a company promoting them, or some kind of organization, right? Because none of them has achieved protocol rigidity. None of them has enough adoption the way Bitcoin does, where it has 100,000 nodes that without cooperating with each other or communicating with each other are all participating in the protocol. And the rules for the protocol have become a Schelling point. This is the place of convergence. So other altcoins, like to give you an example, Ethereum, for example, has a big name, but the dev team and the founder of Ethereum constantly change the rules for it, right? They call it hard forks. They justify it by needing to upgrade it. But basically, they just have another centralized system that is very slow and expensive to use. It's not even interesting. And there's not a single other system out there that is decentralized. Bitcoin took up the first and only available Schelling point. It had kind of an immaculate conception where the founder was at first anonymous and then disappeared altogether. He just left the scene, and there is good reason to believe that he's dead. Nobody controls it in any way, shape, or form. There is no such thing as a canonical dev team that can dictate the next version for people to upgrade to, just the same way as there is no dev team for the internet, right? No government or corporation or consortium can dictate rules of the internet. They're sort of frozen in place because of inertia of the protocol. So Bitcoin has attained the same status now. In fact, a consortium of companies and miners that comprise 90% of the hash rate and all the big exchanges tried to change the rules of Bitcoin in 2017. They called it S2X. They wanted to double the size of the blocks. And a few days before they were to launch their new version, they realized that 100,000 nodes don't give a damn, right? They would have just created a fork. If they created a larger block, that block would just be ignored by the existing 100,000 nodes. They would create an alternative chain, just like Bitcoin Cash or Bitcoin SV. Those are going rapidly to zero. Every altcoin has a time when it spikes because it's illiquid and its supply is restricted by the founders. It spikes because there's some fiat coming into the cryptosphere thinking that they're gonna, basically index their bets from top to bottom in the first 10 or first 50 coins, and then it eventually goes away. So meanwhile, Bitcoin is still there. It's growing. It's 65 to 80% to 90% of total market capitalization of the entire cryptosphere, depending on how you measure it. If you measure it in a liquidity adjusted way, then Bitcoin is 90%. And it's there. It's growing. It's a rigid protocol. It's basically like the internet, and it has that incentive loop that the guy talked about in the book, where existing store of value usage raises the price, which attracts more miners, which creates more energy destroyed, which increases security, which makes Bitcoin last longer, which attracts more store of value users, and this virtuous cycle continues. So it's like a black hole sucking in more and more value from the rest of the economy. All right, so it's 1:21.
Guys, do we have any other questions?
Okay, what do you think of Ethereum? Well, I think Ethereum is extremely overhyped technologically inferior, controlled by a small group of developers headed by one Pope-like figure, Vitalik Buterin. And it has 5 to 10 Ethereum killer systems trying to dethrone it. So far, everything that's Ethereum has ever promised, they never delivered. So I don't really, believe. I mean, you could say it provides additional marginal utility, but even if it is successful, it become a victim of its own success because of velocity of money issues. But yeah, I'm not of high opinion of Ethereum. Again, Ethereum and every other altcoin is not interesting because it is centralized. In other words, it has a central point of failure and control. The dev team in Ethereum is both a point of failure and a point of control. What's interesting about Bitcoin is that it cannot be altered in a backward incompatible way. That's how you know you can store value in it, because your value, the rules will not change. Additional restrictive rules strengthening the system might appear, but all the existing rules that you're signing up to will remain in place. Absolutely. Do I see an application of BTC to be? Okay, so first of all, corporations and banks already use it today. So let me give you an example. Your company is selling shoes in Brazil, and you want to buy shoes from China. Today, you basically have to apply for an import license from the Central Bank of Brazil, which will allow you to convert a certain amount of currency. And then, it's a very long, cumbersome, and expensive process. Or you can pay the producer in China in Bitcoin, possibly having a third-party escrow company holding the payment until the delivery of the goods. And this is the payment that will bypass the existing central banking cartel and with all the rules and regulations, right? Also, you have Swiss banks today that are opening Bitcoin accounts, and not just Swiss banks. There's some talk of it in Singapore, et cetera, et cetera. Sooner or later, it's inevitable, because the same way as nobody ever voted for gold to become a monetary standard in the 1850s, it was just chosen by the market. Well, Bitcoin is being slowly chosen by the market. Another popular question that I always get is, what happens if US government or other governments ban it? And the simple answer to that is, governments are not monolithic entities. I mean, unless you believe that we can all live in a North Korean-like global totalitarian state with a single dictator, right? Governments consist of people. So for example, 7 years ago, when the US government finally caught the person behind the first dark market, the Silk Road, right? Dread Pirate Roberts, Ross Ulbricht. They had an FBI task force with 3 FBI agents, right? Well, 2 of those FBI agents stole Bitcoins that the government confiscated from the operator of Silk Road, and were later found to be guilty and convicted. The third one probably did it, but they don't have evidence to convict them. Now, so all 3 FBI agents were corrupted by their greed for Bitcoin. Even though they were all Boy Scouts, they were all exemplary FBI agents with long multi-decade track records. So the reason why US government will not ban Bitcoin is because it's been around for 11 years. Many people inside the US government have private Bitcoin holdings through various funds, through hedge funds, through family offices, through simply GBTC fund on the stock market, or simply holding a Coinbase account. Coinbase has 20 to 25 million accounts in the United States. It's basically not, it's kind of like the cat is out of the bag. So it's not going to be banned globally. Although in the early years, it could have been. So I don't expect that. Well, I would recommend to look at something, a company that does it here, or if you're a little more technical, then you can look at Trezor.io, which is a hardware wallet, and Keys.casa, which is a company that does multi-sig holding, where you're in complete control of your own Bitcoin, but they have a backup key for your heirs, and they just sort of automate the things for you nicely. If you want to store it on your own, you can store it on your Trezor. Now, you could always trust a third party. If you don't know how to do it, you can keep it on Coinbase or Gemini, and just have them take care of security if you want. Or it's even simpler, you can always call your broker and have them buy GBTC fund on the stock market, which is just holding Bitcoin, but is always trading at a certain premium between 0 to 100% to the price of Bitcoin, because of the way the fund is structured. It's a closed-end fund that cannot create shares in response to new demand and so forth. Will there be any other Sanriosi? Okay, wait a second. Scenarios. Scenarios for what?
Use a Bitcoin technology. Other than monetary applications like we have now, right?
Oh,
basically, now is a monetary application, but you know, if you want to, if let's say it want to replace the database in a bank, so it's totally inefficient. So are there any other scenarios other than the, you know, other than this?
Oh, I see. If you're talking about what's called blockchain technology.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm very skeptical about blockchain technology. It's basically, you know, it was called a time chain in the initial Satoshi code, but there is one application where it's proven to be useful, and that you can create a centralized database system which has one additional attribute of transparency for its users. So as an example of this, Royal Gold Mint in the UK is now trading its gold using a private blockchain where participants can see in a transparent way the whole history of all the transactions, and it's no longer opaque. You know, there's sort of like a more of an open room bidding and auction going on. But again, it's completely centralized. Its rules can be changed, but it has this one additional attribute of cryptographic transparency, because it's impossible to alter the history in the past without everybody noticing. So in a sense that all the downstream users are auditing the history at all times, but they can't, but the rules can be changed. So this additional transparency feature is the one thing you can get with blockchains. But other than that, when central banks issue digital currencies, those will not even use blockchain technology. They will use centralized databases like Visa. So yeah, I'm very skeptical on it.
Are there any other questions, guys? Сейчас, подожди, я хочу им дать им еще один opportunity. Бадья, это правит ли? Может быть, maybe, okay. Yeah.
I made it public now.
Okay, guys, if you don't have any other questions, then we'll let our guests go, okay? So we will see each other on Wednesday. And on Wednesday, we are going to start a new topic, which is dark pools and all that, okay? And this will be our last topic for the semester.
All right, guys,
okay?
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Батя, очень хорошо.